Welcome to another episode of It's Settled, the Amitros podcast, where you'll hear authentic stories of overcoming adversity after a life-changing injury and how injury survivors, members, and industry experts are making a difference. I'm Andrea Mills, Chief Client Officer at Amitros.
And I'm John Kane, Senior Vice President of Strategy. If today's episode inspires you, please subscribe and leave a review to help inspire more listeners facing similar situations. Now, it's settled. Let's get on to the episode and explore the human side of workers' comp and insurance claims.
Well, welcome to another Amitros podcast series. It's Settled. I'm your co-host, John Kane, along with Andrea. Andrea?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited for our guest today and our topic, which is Medicare and CMS updates. So today we're joined by Dan Anders with Tower MSA. Dan?
Hi.
Dan, we'd love to hear a little bit about your kind of journey into working at Tower and, being a Medicare expert as you are in our space. So how did you pick this career and get here? We always love to know.
Sure. Yeah. So I took work comp in junior high and no, actually, yeah, and it wasn't elective, not required. Most people in the industry probably don't know this. My former life was actually in politics and government, not an elected official, but out of college, I worked on the reelection campaign for the Illinois Attorney General. He got reelected. I became a public information officer in the Attorney General's office and went to law school at night over the course of 4 years. He then ran against the infamous Rod Blagojevich, who some of you may have heard of, the former governor of Illinois, who tried to sell the Senate seat vacated by Barack Obama. But we obviously lost that election, became governor at that point. And that's about the same point that I graduated from law school. And interesting side note to that, I mentioned Barack Obama. Barack Obama, it would have been 2003, was the commencement speaker at my law school graduation. And at that time, he was a state senator, far from becoming president. And years later, I was contacted by a reporter about a story and asking, well, did you know, or these other people interviewing the article at the time that were there, like that that person would become president of the United States? And I think everybody said no, there wasn't really anything that we noted at the time. And the story was about him becoming a better speaker over the course of the years since then. But getting back to my self, so I had a colleague at that point when I graduated from law school who was at a work comp defense firm and said, "Hey, we're looking for a position available for an attorney. Are you interested in workers' compensation?" So my response was, "What is workers' compensation?" And he said, "Well, you need a job, just come in and interview." So I came in and interviewed, got hired, and then had to learn workers' compensation. But the interesting note about that, on my first day at the firm, and this, I had taken the bar exam and actually hadn't got my results yet, so couldn't practice. So they had to do something with me. So they gave me an office, and the managing partner comes in and puts this folder about that thick on my desk, and opened it up, and it was about Medicare set-asides and basically what they had accumulated to date on it. And interestingly, our former president, Amy Bilton, who had recently left the firm, had started that folder, and this was back in 2003, on Medicare set-aside. So essentially, I was given the task of developing a Medicare set-aside program at the firm, which I did, and essentially became the resource. We submitted Medicare set-asides at that time, and it was pretty basic. You just had treatment in there. And it wasn't as extensive as you see now with Medicare set-asides. But that's how I got my introduction to both workers' compensation and a Medicare set-aside. So was at the law firm for 6 years, and then was contacted by a colleague in the industry asking, whether I have any interest in doing all this MSA work full time. That was with MedAllocators, which is now ExamWorks Compliance Solutions. So I said, hey, if I can work from home and not have over an hour commute from the city every day, I'll go for that. So I went for it and was with MedAllocators ExamWorks for 7 years. I've been with Tower for 7 years, but that is a bit of a background on how I got to where I am today.
Amazing. And then what is your role at Tower MSA today?
So I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for Tower, which means I pretty much have my hands in everything from the sense of quality assurance, our protocols and practices and guidelines for writing and drafting MSAs, Section 111 reporting, and conditional payment services, working with our clients on just day-to-day matters, doing training for them, going to conferences, giving presentations, and kind of everything else included is my job responsibilities.
Lovely. What would you tell your younger self right out of law school that would motivate you or keep you interested in workers' comp and Medicare set-asides, like as a career path? Like,
yeah, no, beyond they give you a paycheck. Well, and I've got mixed feelings about workers' compensation. When I got into it, it was quite a learning curve, and they really throw you into it. But over time, I certainly got more and more interested and involved in how it works. But I got even more interested in the specialized nature of Medicare set-aside and Medicare secondary payer work. So I guess what I would tell my young self is probably still do what I did, which was to concentrate on the MSA work. When I think back, I used to have, people looked at me at the firm as getting stuck with this job, at having to deal with MSAs. And I remember one of my colleagues there said, don't mind them. What you have is specialized, and it differentiates you essentially in the market, so to speak. We all know we're comp defense attorneys, but something different here, which proved correct, because then I eventually left the firm to do this work full time.
So Dan, you mentioned the folder that was given to you back in 2003, and probably back then it was probably a smaller folder. But as we know, the landscape has changed, and we've recently seen several updates. What would you say is the biggest challenge when facing Medicare compliance?
Yeah, so back then it would have been the famous or infamous, depending on your view, Patel memo, and maybe a couple other memos that had come out since then. So the folder has gotten much thicker. And I'd say, when you look at Medicare compliance work, you always look at kind of the three buckets of Section 111 reporting, conditional payments, and Medicare set-asides. Section 111 reporting, it get frustrating, but it's really a technical requirement, and you just have to make sure the information is entered. Conditional payments can be frustrating in the sense you have to address them, and a lot of times there's payments on there that are unrelated. But again, you have to go through the busy work of disputing those, but more often than not, Medicare will agree and remove those charges. So that's not bad. So that leaves Medicare set-asides, which I would say is really the biggest challenge, because you have the cost of the allocation itself, which sometimes can be prohibitive to settling the case. And then there's the documentation requirements just needed to prepare that MSA, and more importantly, if you're submitting, get it approved by CMS. And then you also have just getting that injured worker familiar with what this weird thing is that gets added on to their settlement. And then, what you handle with Mitros, the whole administration, that, not only are you this continues beyond your settlement. So it's not like you get a check and then you're done. Now you're having to deal with this. So that's certainly, I would say, that the largest or the most significant challenge that you have when it comes to Medicare.
Yeah, and again, it's a ever evolving, compliance with Medicare. You mentioned the big three, just from a, carrier perspective. It's professional juggling, trying to keep up, with all the updates. And, one of the recent updates was with the beneficiary and notifying the Med Advantage plans. If you can talk to the audience a little bit about that recent release.
Yeah, so there were a couple components and an update. So a couple updates. There's an update to the CMS Work Comp MSA reference guide. So that's essentially what we call the Bible for Medicare set-asides that lays out the rules and practices. And then there's what's called a MSA self-administration toolkit that provides the rules for administering the MSA. It's self-administration, but there's essentially professional administration. You also follow a lot of those same rules. So they added a few different provisions to those guides around Medicare Advantage plans, and when you have an MSA, how that is administered with those plans. So I think it's over half of Medicare beneficiaries now have a Medicare Advantage plan. So the rules are different when it comes to whether you're enrolled in Advantage plan or Original Medicare. So Original Medicare, Medicare's, if you have Original Medicare and you have an MSA, essentially CMS itself and its contractors are going to manage that MSA in the sense of if a bill comes into Medicare and they determine it's unrelated, or I should say it's related to your Medicare set aside, then they'll deny it and indicate it goes back to the MSA. It's different though with the Medicare Advantage plan because it's up to the Medicare Advantage plan to have information on that MSA such that they can do the same thing in terms of saying deny payment for a bill that comes in, that instead it should be going to that MSA. So what Medicare indicated is that they notify the Medicare Advantage plan, Part C, and also prescription drug plans, Part D, that there's a Medicare set-aside. The difficulty is that that's basically all they do. They don't give much more information beyond that. So what they indicated in this update to the guide is there's an expectation that Medicare beneficiary who has the MSA is going to work with that Medicare Advantage plan on the administration of that MSA. What's unclear, my takeaway from that is, okay, that makes sense. How does that communication work? Because there's multiple different Medicare Advantage plans. How does that work with Humana versus Blue Cross? What's the expectation of communication there? So I still think there's some unanswered questions there from an administrator standpoint. Now, John, you may have some information you can, talk about in terms of how that works from a Metro standpoint in dealing with an Advantage plan, because I would think from a self-administrator standpoint, it would be more confusing.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be challenging for an injured worker to administer and keep up with all of these responsibilities. This is just another responsibility. And, with these Med Advantage plans, you might have an injured worker that goes with one plan 1 year and they don't like the medical provider in the network,
Right.
and they change out, and then they have to notify, the next plan. So, at Amitros, we're going to, assist those individuals with notifying the plans. They want to see the MSA, if there's any changes with the prescriptions, they want to be notified. And the reason for that is that, they want to coordinate benefits. They want to make sure that, if it's related to the work injury and covered by Medicare, that they're not making payment. So they're going to flag their system. And as a professional administrator, we would work with them to notify, if the funds do exhaust when they would be picking up the payment. So another recent update was with the beneficiary reference guide, and this was to assist the injured workers, if they were responsible for the conditional payments
Mhm.
post settlement. If you can talk to the audience a little bit about that guide and the reasoning why they came out with it.
Yeah, so my view, it's always good to have guides from Medicare because it helps whoever is dealing with Medicare not only better understand the process and how they should go about communicating with Medicare, but also the lawyer in me, it gives you something to cite on these disputes or appeals and saying, well, here's the rule that Medicare has put out there. So um, several years back, Medicare put out an appeals guide for essentially the employers and the carriers and how they can appeal conditional payments, and it gives the details on how to do that. And before getting into the beneficiary appeals guide, it's important to understand, when does that beneficiary get involved in the sense that they have to appeal. So essentially, Medicare has two ways of collecting conditional payments. One is through a contractor called the CRC, the Commercial Repayment Center, and they collect largely against payers, so the employers, self-insured companies, insurers. The CRC collects against them, essentially for conditional payments that are made during the course of a accepted work comp claim. However, if there's conditional payments that remain outstanding post-settlement, or if you're dealing with, say, a personal injury liability claim, Medicare is going to collect against the claimant Medicare beneficiary. So that's where another contractor gets involved, the BCRC, the Benefits Coordination Recovery Center. So this appeals guide then is essentially the guide for that injured worker or somebody who's representing them to understand exactly how they handle Medicare conditional payment demands that come in, and specifically, how do they dispute and appeal those charges. And it's a very thorough guide, and I would certainly recommend it to anybody that is handling conditional payment demands from the BCRC, because it really does lay out everything you need to know in order to handle those.
Awesome. Yeah, just to add that with the responsibility with BCRC, that once the case does settle, then the debtor becomes the injured worker versus the carrier. And that's important because, it also goes back to how the case was negotiated with respect to how the conditional payments are going to be handled. Is it going to be through the, carrier or the beneficiary? And, with Medicare, once the case settles, they're only going to communicate with the injured worker. So in that situation, if the carrier was responsible, then there should be a consent form signed so that the carrier can, interact with BCRC and, help resolve any outstanding debt. So I think it was helpful. I think it was something that was missing, and, CMS noticed that, there should be some additional, context for the injured worker in order to resolve their conditional payments. So yet another change with CMS is the Section 111 reporting. adding fields for the MSA. So if we can kind of talk through that and include how that may impact like non-submit MSAs as well.
Yeah, no, this is a big one because we haven't had a change like this in terms of the addition of reporting fields really since the outset of reporting. We've had the additional fields to provide Medicare Advantage plan information, but that's really a one-way information where that's coming from Medicare to the RRE, the payer, so to speak. This is requiring the RRE and whoever is handling that at the desk level to enter specific information related to a Medicare set-aside. As of, it was originally January of 25, and everyone pleaded with have a bit more time because it is a big technical change with adding fields to a system to give more time. So they extended that out with a April 4th, 2025 start date, where Medicare is going to expect that anytime a TPAC, total payment obligation of the claimant, spell out that terminology, is reported to Medicare through Section 111 reporting on a work comp case, only work comp, that you're also going to report an MSA amount. And that MSA amount could be zero, but you nonetheless have to report an MSA amount. Not only do you have to report an MSA amount, you also have to indicate the years that the MSA is expected to cover, whether it's typically over life expectancy or after a rated age of reduced life expectancy that is utilized. You're also going to have to tell Medicare whether it's a lump sum or annuity, how long that's going to be. If there's a professional administration company, you have to provide that information as well. And I should say, if there's a structure, Medicare also wants to know how much is the seat amount, as well as the annual payments, and all except I think the professional administrator EIN, their identification number,
right,
are required. Meaning, if you don't provide the information or you put in incorrect information, that's called a hard error, which causes the report to be rejected. And that's important because we have penalties coming up next month, the start of that. So if your report's rejected and that's not corrected timely, then that could potentially cause penalties to be imposed. So it's, like I said, it's a very big thing, and it's going to be, it's a technical change right now, but then it's going to be a training challenge because a lot of this is handled at the desk level by the claims professional who is entering this information. So they'll need to be brought up to speed as to this needing to be entered on cases going forward. And then, what effect is this going to have beyond, potential penalties or if something is not entered correctly? So, my thoughts on it, a twofold, I'd say, is, do we see more, and keep in mind, like I said, it's anytime you enter a TPAC, you have to enter this MSA information. So, the $25,000 review threshold doesn't apply, that we have where CMS is going to review and approve an MSA. So you're looking at what we call under threshold cases as well. So, we'll see, some parties that may now be doing zero MSAs, do they now allocate for a certain amount? Or if they don't do that, do they do a formal MSA and actually, get a report, say from a Tower or some other company, and incorporate that into the settlement? I think that's, especially those under threshold cases, that's where we'll see some movement, because ultimately, I should point out, why is CMS doing this is, one, they don't always get the final settlement documents uploaded to them on CMS approved MSA. So this gives them another kind of way to catch those. And two, this gives them visibility into under threshold MSAs.
Right. Yeah, it's going to give them, the ability to coordinate benefits, whether it's voluntarily submitted or non-submitted. And it's also interesting too that they're asking for the number of years that the MSA is being funded for. Your traditional submit is going to be, for a lifetime. That's the expectation. Whereas, you might have some of these smaller cases where, the treatment might only be for the next 2 or 3 years. CMS is going to monitor it. We'll see what happens in terms of, if some of these MSAs that are not submitted, if they exhaust, how CMS is going to, react with those.
Definitely think there was lots of excitement in the Medicare world this summer with CMS doing, I think, 2 updates within 2 weeks. And then we're all patiently awaiting April 4th, 2025. But I did want to chat with you both because you both have extensive histories, working with Medicare set-asides and your respective jobs and everything in the past, 20 plus years. But, when you think about what's driving up the costs of MSAs, Dan, would love to get your opinions. And then John, if you have anything to add to that.
Sure.
Sure. So I think it starts from understanding the methodology that CMS uses. And when we're driving up the cost, I assume we're talking more about, the standpoint of CMS approved MSAs, the methodology that CMS uses when reviewing and approving MSAs. And that really is one, and they've said it themselves, as they look at these as a worst case scenario, which means that if there's mention of a surgery in the records, they're likely going to include it. If medications are being utilized, they're going to allocate them for a person's life expectancy. If there's any mention of injections, things like that, in those records, it's likely going to be allocated unless you have specific references or statements from treating physicians indicating that they're not going to be utilized. And part of this, and again, it's that understanding as well as understanding from the standpoint of the payer or the injured worker that the process is set up to handle MSAs on people who are at maximum medical improvement. Now, that's not always done. I mean, we submit MSAs for people that are not always at MMI, and that creates its own challenge because Medicare will tend to just allocate based upon the current treatment and medications, and that can be costly. So, understanding that then leads to, okay, if you know what drives up the cost, what can you do to mitigate those costs going forward? I always start that the easiest is, which we get on most MSAs, is a rated age. And sometimes people don't understand just how important that is to reducing costs on an MSA. Because if you knock off a few years in life expectancy, that you might not have a revision surgery, and will knock out MRIs and X-rays and expensive medications. But beyond that is, and it's something that we pride ourselves on doing at Tower, is once making that assessment and saying, okay, well, yeah, this MSA projection is high. How can we address those costs to mitigate them? And that often is reaching out to that treating physician and clarifying what's going on in terms, are they still on these medications? Is a surgery that you mentioned, a year ago in passing, is that really something that is necessary, or because of treatment that's occurred over the past 12 months, it's no longer even a consideration. So, we do that complimentary for our clients, but it allows so many more opportunities to utilize these MSAs as part of settlement because of mitigating those costs.
Yeah, I would just add to that, CMS has a, pretty rigid, formula in terms of how they want these MSAs projected. They use average wholesale price, which is generally 10 to 15% over, what
Right.
the retail price is. Dan was talking about, the possibility versus, probable surgeries. You have surgeries, you have joint replacements, you have spinal cord stimulators, and in the medical records, it might just say, well, if the person's condition worsens, we might consider spinal cord stimulator. Well, in the eyes of CMS, you're going to need to include that spinal cord stimulator because it was mentioned in the medical records. So again, it's important to, evaluate the medical records, having maybe, a nurse look at it, reach out to the attending physician, coordinate with the injured workers attorney in regards to that possibility and whether or not it is a possibility, especially if the pain scale is down, their activities of daily living are up. It may no longer be, even considered in the future. So, taking those steps ahead of obtaining the MSA and submissions beneficial. Some of the medical, providers don't necessarily keep on top of their medical records to update, if you're seeing them monthly or quarterly. So reviewing those records to make sure that the treatment is still current, any of the prescriptions, if they've been weaned off or discontinued medications, make sure those come out of the MSA so that when it is submitted to CMS, what the expectation is. So,
yeah, I mean, I would add just to be a little critical on CMS. Like I said, I've been submitting these for 20 years. Is I have seen a slide. At some, it started out as including care that was reasonably probable. I see more and more where it's anything possible, and that makes everybody frustrated because, just in treatment records, a lot of times physicians will reference different things. Oh, maybe injections, maybe surgery. Of course, those are always possibilities, but are they really at a point where they're a recommendation? I do think there's a line there, and sometimes there's I think it's just becoming more of a slippery slope in terms of what's being added. Now, on Medicare side, I would add that they don't factor in medical inflation, so you do get present value on these, and for treatments that I'm sure will cost more, obviously, if they're years from now.
Yeah. And Dan, how is Tower and you thinking about professional administration and helping to position that on the Medicare set asides as you work through those files with your clients?
Yeah, and when it comes to administration of the MSA, I mean, I just put myself in the shoes of an injured worker and facing this, and all except for perhaps maybe this is the most basic MSAs. I don't know why you wouldn't do professional administration because it's essentially free to the injured worker. It's factored, the cost is factored in to the settlement. And you essentially have someone that is going to handle your bills, but also not have to put you through UR or IMEs as you did when you had an open workers' compensation claim. So, as you know, we partner with Amitros to offer these services to our clients because they're invaluable not only for the service itself, but to also facilitate settlement. You talked earlier about the challenge with the MSA, and it's just getting the injured worker to understand what this is and that this isn't just a lump of money and they're done with it. Now they have this MSA that's going to handle their medical bills going forward. So, it's just a critical component and something that we emphasize to the greatest extent we can when working with our clients or directly with the injured worker as being a key component of settlement.
Awesome. We'd love to hear that. And then, thinking about not only is there the Medicare set aside component, but Tower's also preparing the non-Medicare items report, or the items that wouldn't otherwise be covered by Medicare, but maybe they're part of the case and they'll help get the case settled if, additional monies are
Right.
offered for the non-Medicare piece. You guys are obviously offering that product as well. And, how does that work from a technical standpoint? Because we always get questions post settlement, like, hey, I was, so and so carrier was paying for this drug for me, but that's not Medicare covered. And then how do you, work with the clients to look at those non-Medicare covered items?
Yeah, so with our clients, it's really on a client per client basis, and sometimes a case by case basis. Some we don't even include non-Medicare covered items. Others, they always want the non-Medicare covered items included. And from an administration standpoint, I mean, we just have to go through and explain how these are separated out, that they can't come out of the MSA. There's a separate fund that's going to be separate set up. And, again, that can be professionally administered as well, but it's a separate fund that's going to handle those types of costs. And that might be, certain non-Medicare covered medications, or if someone has a, catastrophic type injury, certain adaptions that might be needed, or, if there's certain types of home health care or long-term care that may not be Medicare covered, it may come out of that other bucket.
Yep, absolutely. Well, and as it pertains to CMS updates or Medicare set-asides, is there anything else that you would, think we should be asking you or you wanted to cover before we talk about some other areas?
I think that's really what is kind of the most pressing issues we've seen with MSAs. There is going to be, if people have more questions around Section 111 reporting and the updates there, CMS just announced they're doing a webinar on September 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern. So if you go on the CMS website for that, you can get information and ask questions that you might have around, especially around the Section 111 reporting of MSAs.
Amazing. Well, I wanted to take a couple of minutes and talk about the Medicare Secondary Payer Network. So both of you, John and Dan, are both past presidents of that organization. And I happen to be a board member. So, shameless plug here for the Medicare Secondary Payer Network. We do have a conference coming up here in latter part of September. So just wanted to have you both kind of speak about MSPN, how you got involved with it, why the organization is so important to the industry and, the clients that we work with, as well as the injured workers. So, Dan, why don't we start with you, and then John, would love to hear your thoughts too.
Sure. So I say that I somewhat learned on the streets how to write MSAs because when I started, there was no organization out there that brought people together to talk about MSP. I think 03, I think NAMSAP, the former name for MSPN, started in 05, and I think I became a member maybe in 06. But it really brings together essentially all of us that handle MSP work. You might say the leading authorities on MSP compliance from the private sector, and over the past several years also bring in CMS and from the government side as a organization to share information. So we have monthly webinars on various MSP issues. We have podcasts, and then we have our annual conference coming up here at the end of September that brings together, again, private and government individuals, essentially all of us that are involved in Medicare secondary payer work, to not only have sessions on all of the different issues that we talked about today, but even beyond those. And not only have they have the opportunity to listen to sessions, but to talk to people from CMS to understand their perspective and give your perspective on things. And just an excellent networking opportunity as well. I probably met John years ago at one of these conferences.
Well, thanks, Dan. As you know, Medicare compliance has been around for a while, going back, beyond, 2001. But after 2001, we had this cottage industry that was created. And all of a sudden, people started talking about Medicare. I know when I talk about Medicare with my wife, she usually tunes me out. But with an organization, like MSPN, we have others that we can, talk with and bounce ideas off of, all the changes we talked about today. MSPN is a great forum for education. As we said, we have the annual conference coming up at the end of the month. And additional plug, you can Google MSPN network and pull that up and then look at the, annual conference in Baltimore. But again, it's great, great information in terms of all of these updates, that are coming up with Section 111 reporting, the MSAs. We've developed a great working relationship, with CMS officials, talking through our insights, what we're seeing from our end in terms of trends, any nuances, any issues, and, providing advocacy for, effective change. And, again, we've developed a really good working relationship, with CMS. They are going to be there attending and participating. So, we hope you all could join.
You mentioned your wife tunes you out. My mom recently went on mymedicare.gov and saw a tab there for Medicare set-asides and called me up and said, "So you really weren't lying. There's actually these things called Medicare set-asides that you are making a career out of."
This isn't makeup stuff, Mom. It's real.
I know.
Amazing. Well, before we started recording the podcast, I was sharing that my air conditioner is broken, and there was an air conditioning man here, and I was like, "Hey, between this hour, I'm going to be, recording a podcast." And he was like, "About what?" And I was like, "Work stuff," and I didn't even want to get into it. You don't need to worry about it, sir. He was a young man. He probably will never have to deal with this for a long time or think about it. Hopefully,
All right.
But speaking of, CMS participating in our MSPN conference coming up, we recently also worked on with CMS, and Dan, you were there, and so was John, the Florida Workers' Comp Conference, also known as WCI. We all hosted the Medicare secondary payer panels, which were, 3 different sessions ranging in a lot of different topics, but CMS was able to participate in every panel that we did. And I thought that was really interesting too. And I also thought that was a really big draw to have their presence, with us in Orlando, and their ability to participate in those and provide, insights and take questions from the audience and stuff. That was really well received, I think. And I think from the past sessions I've been to, the most people I've seen attend an afternoon session regarding Medicare. So I was pretty impressed with that. So, thanks to you, Dan and John, for being a part of those. But did anything stick out from you with those panels that, we should share with the broader audience here?
Well, I think John and me thought that the standing room only was for us, but now that you've said it was CMS, that seems to make more sense. So CMS has been part of the conference for 3 or 4 years. This was the first time that they came in person. So that was very nice to have them in person, because I think that makes a difference at actually having them there. I moderate a panel with John on pre-settlement considerations. And, I think having them there to really emphasize the role that CMS plays and why they do what they do. I mean, we've seen that with MSPN for many years now, but that's kind of us MSP nerds in the industry, whereas WCI is getting at, defense attorneys and adjusters and risk managers to actually have them be able to hear from CMS. I think really drives the points home more to why they have to engage in Medicare secondary payer compliance.
Yeah, it was definitely a great session. I mean, there were 3 sessions in total. We talked about, the history, of the MSA. We talked about, preparing for the MSA, and then, what happens post-settlement. And we got into some discussion in regards to, CMS with the administrative piece. As we know in the reference guide, they highly recommend professional administration, talking through some of the challenges that individual faces, once they settle out their case. Do they know what the state fee schedule is? There's several issues there. So, during our track, we talked through that and, provided the audience, with, from an injured worker's perspective, the challenges that they faced. But the sessions all were well attended, and I think it was a big benefit for folks to attend. So good session.
Yeah. Well, I think we are about at time. Dan, when is the next CMS webinar, just so we can remind our listeners?
So CMS webinar is September 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And I'm actually going to be Tower is going to have a webinar on MSA issues on October 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern. So we're actually going to send out a notice on that next week for people who want to get more into depth on Medicare set-aside matters.
I was going to say the annual conference is September 25th through 27th. And if for some reason you can't travel, you can attend, virtually. There is that option. So mark it on your calendars.
Amazing. We'd love to see you attend in person or virtually. And then just another plug for John. He recently wrote an article called A Deep Dive into CMS, MSAs, and Administration. So that is also on the Amitros blog and on our LinkedIn, should you want to get some additional reading on Medicare. But Dan, this was fun. Thank you so much for joining our podcast, and appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to It's Settled, the Amitros podcast. Find us on major streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review means a lot to us. It helps us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. For more information about Amitros, please visit our website at amitros.com. That's AMETROS.com.
Join us in our next episode for more uplifting stories. It's settled. On to the next time. Stay inspired and continue making positive impact.